Boston's educational system was the oldest in the country, but it had been created as kind of a patchwork. As different educational ideas or trends emerged, the city would embrace some. So we have, for example, the Latin school from 1635. Its idea is to teach Latin as a way of getting boys into college. Then in the first part of the 19th century, Boston has its first high school, the English school. Latin is where you would go if you were bound for college. English is a high school, is a school to teach English for those who will be working in commerce and other mercantile trades. And then we have the adoption of kindergarten, the adoption of manual training. So there's a variety of different educational opportunities, if you want to think of it that way, in Boston. There's a high school of commerce, the Latin school. There's a girls' Latin school, because Latin would be all boys until 1974 or so. The English high school. English and Latin were both exam schools. The high schools of commerce and Boston Tech would be schools for those not going on to college but needing a good education, particularly as high school becomes something that is mandated in the early 20th century. In 1900 or so, the city builds a series of high schools. Now, the neighborhood high schools, South Boston High, Jamaica Plain High School, and so on, were not designed to send students to college. Their real purpose was to educate a blue-collar workforce. So the primary major at South Boston High School was sheet metal work. In Charlestown High School, it was, I believe, becoming an electrician. Jamaica Plain actually had an agricultural focus. So you have different kinds of manual training being offered at the different neighborhood high schools. And the idea is that if you wanted to go into one field or another, you would gravitate toward one of these high schools teaching a particularly valuable trade. You would, of course, have to get yourself to that school at your own expense. Now, there are grammar schools to which every child would go, and in each neighborhood, the grammar schools. And from the grammar schools or elementary schools, you would matriculate into a junior high school. And then from the junior high school, you would matriculate into a high school. By the early 1960s, Boston was last among the 15 major American cities in the number of high school graduates who went to college. In fact, the number was about 1 in every 4. Boston public school graduates would go to college. If we take out those who went to the exam schools and those who instead went to a neighborhood high school, the number is actually closer to 1 in 8. So, for example, 6% of the graduates of South Boston High School would go to college. It's a system designed to train a blue-collar workforce. You don't need that many college-educated people in this society in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s because most people are getting jobs in the shipyards or in these various industries in Boston or with these various mechanical arts being offered at these different schools in the city. So this is the way the system had been created. Now, Boston's schools were run by a school committee elected at large, an unpaid school committee, 5 members, whose job was to oversee the schools. Now, the real focus of members of the school committee was to help find jobs for their supporters, as the schools are one of the largest sources of jobs in the city. You need teachers, you also need custodians, you need various people working in the school department. And the school committee is a great place to know what jobs are available in the schools. A patronage operation, just as other elected officials will use patronage as a way to maintain their elective position. Now, in the early 1960s, as Boston is undergoing its urban renewal and looking at ways to revitalize itself, the Boston Redevelopment Authority looks at the schools and sees that the schools in Boston really are in need of a massive overhaul. There hadn't been a new school built in Boston since 1934, and many of the schools date to the time of the Civil War. That is, an antiquated school building, their physical plant of the school department is antiquated. At the same time, the population of the city is shifting around, and the schools themselves are way behind the educational times in terms of curriculum and so on. And what the BRA fears is that families thinking about where to live will look at the antiquated schools of Boston and decide to live somewhere else. As the BRA's idea is to bring in young and upscale or upwardly mobile young people who will want to live their lives contributing in the city of Boston, and if they see that the schools are in decrepit condition, they will look elsewhere. So in 1962, the BRA issues its report and calls for replacing 70 of the existing schools in Boston by 1975, and also calls for creating a large central high school campus somewhere in Boston, perhaps in Franklin Park, perhaps in Columbus Park, somewhere where you could bring together these various educational institutions, a Latin school, English school, Boston Tech, put them all in one place and bring the children from all over the city to this central high school complex. This will be a difficult thing to get through because one way the city prevented outright graft was to make it impossible for the school department itself to build schools. The school committee is elected, doesn't answer to the mayor. The mayor is responsible for the city's budget. The mayor would have to approve of expenditures for school construction, but they don't also give the mayor the power to oversee school construction because they don't want the mayor doing things which violate school policy. So Boston had a very strange system for allocating resources for the schools. The school department was not responsible for building schools. The mayor was not responsible for building schools. Instead, an autonomous body, the school building department, was in charge of building schools, and the school building department didn't really answer to anybody. One reason it was difficult to build new schools, and something that the BRA certainly wanted to rein in. There was a call to replace the elected school committee with a body chosen by the mayor that would be able to build schools, but it would be very difficult to get the school department to agree to that, or the voters who elected the school committee in any given 2-year cycle. So these are some of the problems Boston schools faced in the early 1960s. And in early 1963, the Boston Globe looked ahead to what was in store for the Boston School Committee in the coming year, and they thought the big issue really was the Sargent report of the BRA and what to do about the schools. And they did think that the school committee, now led by Louise Day Hicks from South Boston, was actually in good hands. Mrs. Hicks, very firm runner of meetings, was called the Iron Duchess because she didn't put up with the kind of long-winded nonsense that went on in these school committee meetings that would begin at 5 p.m. and might not end till after midnight because the school committee people who weren't being paid for their efforts simply found great opportunities to talk at great length. They didn't anticipate what would become the real issue in Boston. At the same time, you have us looking, or have the BRA looking at problems in schools. The African American community in Boston is deeply sensitive to the fact that schools in their neighborhoods are among the most antiquated in the system. In Roxbury and the South End, schools built at the time of the Civil War, which are now overcrowded. And because the school committee did devise the educational districts for the schools, schools in the black community tended to be crowded, as did schools in other parts of the city. Schools in South Boston were operating on double sessions because there weren't enough seats in the classrooms. Meanwhile, there are schools in other parts of the city with empty seats, and the school department itself didn't have a good way of telling how many children were going to which school. So you have lots of problems in the school committee, and what happens in June of 1963 is that the NAACP, or the Boston chapter of the NAACP, asks to meet with the school committee, and they present what they see as the problems in the schools in the African American community. And the African American community, I should point out, is actually growing in Boston. The population of the city as a whole was declining, but the African American percentage of the population was growing to about 15 or 20% by 1970. It had been about 8 to 10% in the 1950s. So in June of 1963, the NAACP meets with the school committee, presents what they see as the problems in the schools, and also wants the school committee to recognize that the Boston public schools are segregated, not by law, but by fact. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court had said that de jure segregation, segregation by law, violates the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, violates the 14th Amendment rights of African American students, that de jure segregation deprives them of equal educational opportunities. De facto segregation is segregation that emerges just because of the way people live or neighborhood patterns. And there's a coming recognition that de facto segregation is just as wrong as de jure segregation. The NAACP asked the school committee to acknowledge that it was in fact running a school system that was segregated, and the school committee refused. And what happens is a polarization over this issue. The school committee won't acknowledge that there is de facto segregation in the schools. The black community stages a one-day walkout of black students, an opening of freedom schools on that one day. So you have the school committee digging in its heels on the issue of de facto segregation, and the black community that have brought forth problems in the schools. The fact that the school buildings themselves were decrepit, the fact that schools in the black community were crowded or overcrowded, and the fact that black students could not easily transfer to another school. And you have that issue, the issue of de facto segregation, becoming the overriding issue which is going to tear apart the school department and dominate city politics for the next 30 years.